How's it going, guys? It's me, the Techie Gamer, back with another video, and in today's video I want to talk about resolution and some of the misconceptions of what it actually is and what people are saying about it. It's probably not something that is out there, but from time to time I hear a lot of things that I would either say is wrong at the time or that is right and I would agree with. But anyways, let's get into this. So before we really jump in, what is resolution? Resolution is the height by width of pixels that make up a display. A lot of people, and I actually thought this a little bit ago, is the total number of pixels on the screen, which it's not. So I want to ask you guys a question before I dive into any more of this. So I want you guys to answer these two questions in your head. First is, what would you multiply by to get 4K resolution from a 1080p resolution? Or I guess, what scale would that be? And then next, what scale would it be if it was 1440p from 720p? The correct answer for 4K, the 4K question and the 1440p question, they are both 2. I'm sure most, if not all of you, probably got at least one right. 1440p is obviously 2 times from 720, but for those who are scratching their heads or getting ready to dislike the video because you're sure that I'm wrong about 4K or perhaps the 1440p question, let me just say that 4K is actually 2160p, which is the width of the resolution 3840 by 2160, or 4K. 4K, for whatever reason, is measured by the length instead of the width as a category for the resolution it is at, rather than the width. For example, 1920 by 1080 is 1080p. However, with 4K, it's measured by its length, which is 3840. So now you can see that 1080p is really only half of 4K, or should I say 2160p. That is not the only misconception, though. I'm sure most or half of you aren't scratching your heads, as you might understand, but I will attempt to ease the other half with this misconception. This one isn't really known that well, but it is a kind of make it or break it for this situation. Even though not many people think of this, and it isn't really much of a debate, but it is a controversial one, and that is what resolution is really defined by: total pixels on a display or dimensions. This links back to the first one because if you believe that 4K and 1440p is by 4 times, you most likely think that the resolution is the area or the total number of pixels in an image or screen. I can see why people would think this. If you put 4 1080p screens, that would become a single 4K panel. That is because the height and width is multiplied by 2, or in other words, the height and width is twice as much. I also understand why people think that, because if you multiply 3840 by 2160 and you multiply 1920 by 1080 and divide the total of 4K, or 8,294,400 pixels, by the total of 1080, or 2,073,600, you will get 4. So yes, 4K is 4 times as clear or sharp, but that's not resolution. So when they say that 4K has 4 times the pixels, or 4 times as clear, they are right. However, once they say resolution, it isn't exactly true. Now, the first comeback to this that I have heard about an argument that is on the side of total pixels as the definition is an example. So let me explain that. Say you have 100 by 100 pixel display. And then you have another that's a 200 by 100 display. What would be the scale of that? And if resolution was really about dimensions, then what would be the scale of it? This tricked and actually stopped me in my tracks for a second. This example did have a point. If you did the multiplication and division trick for this scale, it is 2 times. However, in terms of resolution, if we're talking about dimensions, this would actually be the same resolution were it to be the same aspect ratio if it were just dimensions. The 100 by 100 would be a 1-to-1 aspect ratio, while the 200 by 100 would be a 2-to-1 scale. These are 2 different aspect ratios, so comparing them resolution-wise wouldn't exactly work unless you had converted them to the same aspect ratio. Converting 100 to 100 to a 2-to-1 scale would be 200 to 100, which is the exact same resolution. Same for fractions. You can't necessarily compare, it would be hard to compare a fraction to to another with a different denominator. It just wouldn't work as well. But then again, that is like comparing a resolution scale of 5 to 4 resolution from a 16 by 9. Or, for example, 500 to 400 to something like 1920 by 1080. However, we can, with resolutions with the same aspect ratios. 4K is half of 1080p in terms of resolution. Aspect ratios can be seen as a kind of proportion, and that if you multiply one side by 2, you kind of have to do the same with the other. Take 1080p and 2160p, or 4K for example. That ratio is a 16 by 9. One side is proportional to that degree to another. So for every 16 units horizontally, there will be 9 vertically. So if the resolution is twice as much, because one side is multiplied by 2, the other would have to be 2. So let's take a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, and let's do a simple length and width that would follow the same principle. 16 and 9. Multiply one side by 2, and it becomes a completely different aspect ratio, as it becomes 32 by 9. But to maintain the aspect ratio, you would have to multiply by 2 to both sides to follow the aspect ratio. It becomes 32 and 18, which still means a 16 by 9 ratio, but the original resolution we started at would be half of 32 by 18, which is just a simplified version of 16 by 9. Same with 1080p and 2160p. 1920 by times 2 is 3840, which it becomes 3840 by 1080, and it becomes a 32 by 9 aspect ratio. But like I said, it has to even out to become a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. So 1080p following a 16 by 9 aspect ratio is technically half of 4K, which follows the same aspect ratio. Just think of an aspect ratio as a single number, as with resolutions. It makes sense too that 1080p is half of 2160p. And for those who still don't believe that resolution is the dimensions and not the total number of pixels, why do we say the dimensions when we talk about resolution? Why not just say the number of pixels that there is in the display or image? And I know that people will just say, well, it's a lot easier than saying 8,294,400 pixels, plus people would know what you're actually talking about. But that's like saying standard measurement would be easier than metric. That just isn't true. It's just because we are so accustomed to resolution or dimensions, or what you would say dimensions, than saying the whole number. It's kind of like saying that we're used to saying sizes of monitors from the diagonal measurement of the panel than saying the width and height. We always say a 27-inch monitor rather than saying a X by Y inch monitor. It could be just as easy as saying the monitor is 8 megapixels. Yes, that's another way of saying 8,294,400. It's sure a lot easier than saying 1920 by 1080 pixels. I mean, we do not do it with monitor measurements, so if resolution was really the total of number of pixels, then in the specs and then just description of the pixel amount, the resolution would be 8 megapixels, not X by Y amount of pixels, or 1080p. Just something to think about. Hopefully you guys understand what resolution really is now, and hopefully some of the misconceptions you might have are solved and straightforward. It just goes to show how companies are misleading in their products, and how they say that 4K is 4 times the resolution of 1080p, when in reality it is only 2 times. Now I'm not saying that it's a big deal or something like that, but it is something that I always found funny, that companies whose job it is to make monitors and TVs could get something wrong. Now, there isn't really an exact definition, as many sources have their own opinion on it, so I could be wrong, but this debate is really up to what you think it is, and it makes more sense that resolution is the dimensions and not total pixels. So anyways guys, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below on what you think resolution is, and if this video helped you in any way. Anyways guys, that is about it, and I will see you all next time. Peace.